Hi, Dave Scotland for Tuts Plus, and welcome to After Effects. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the animation system in After Effects. We're also going to take a look at pre-composing and nesting compositions in After Effects. So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce you to the 11 principles of CG animation. You may be aware of the 12 principles of animation, and that is more specific to drawing. In the absence of drawing, we tend to refer to them as the 11 principles of animation. We've got squash and stretch, timing, anticipation, staging. We've also got follow through and overlapping action. We've got straight ahead versus pose to pose. We've got slow in and slow out, arcs, exaggeration, secondary action, and appeal. Now, I do thoroughly suggest that you have a look in more detail through research online into the 11 principles of animation. These have been formulated over many years, and if you ever hope to get good animation through your visual effects, compositing, and motion graphics work in After Effects, a good understanding of the principles of animation is very important. I'm not going to go into them in detail in this episode. It's really just about the specific animation system in After Effects. So let's start off with some basics. I've just got a very basic composition here with a logo, and I'm just going to explain some of the animation principles in After Effects. I did mention in a previous episode that the stopwatch icon is crucial to animating in After Effects. In fact, it's how we activate the animation for that specific property. Now, in a nutshell, animation is changing a property over time, and basically switching on the stopwatch for a specific property allows you to animate that property over time. So it's very important to make sure you understand these stopwatches and what they mean to animation. You'll find them all over the place, and there are, as I've mentioned in the past, there are multiple avenues for animation in After Effects. So let's have a look at the basics. What I'm going to do with this logo here is start off really simply. At frame 0, I'm going to click on the stopwatch to activate, and it automatically creates a keyframe here for me at frame 0, because that's where my time indicator was sitting when I clicked on the stopwatch. It saved a keyframe for 100% because that's the figure that was set for this particular parameter, the opacity parameter, at that point in time. So why don't I now go through to say 1 second and wind that down. So now you'll see I have another keyframe here, and if I scrub on the timeline, you'll see that it starts at 100% visible, and then it slowly disappears until it reaches that 1 second mark where it's completely gone. I can now go say through to 2 second mark and wind that back up. And as we would expect, the visibility goes down, it reaches invisible, and then it starts to come back to visibility. Now, I'm going to delete that frame and show you how I could have done that by copying the keyframe. I'm just going to highlight this keyframe here. I don't need to have my time slider sitting on that keyframe in order to copy it. In fact, in order to paste it, I need it to be located where I want the new keyframe to be pasted. So I just highlight this keyframe. Control C is the hotkey, or I can go up and go edit and copy, and then I can reposition my time slider where I want the new keyframe to be, and I can go edit and paste, and it will paste the keyframe there. And notice it's an exact replica of the first keyframe, with 100% being the figure in the box here. Just wanted to show you that I can actually have multiple levels of animation going on at the same time. What I'm going to do is sit at this 2 second mark, and I'm going to scale, click on the scale stopwatch, which saves a keyframe at 13.6, which was the original scale figure. And then I'm going to come back to 0, and I'm going to wind that down to 0, and you'll see now that it will scale up as it's fading out, and then it's going to fade in. So the whole time it's actually scaling to its final position here, or final scale. And that process can be replicated throughout the entire layer parameters. So I could animate the anchor point, the position, the rotation, opacity scale. All of these could be animated at the exact same time. In fact, I could take the first keyframe here and delete it, and then basically it would start to zoom, and then it would fade in from 1 second until it got to 2 seconds. In fact, what I could do is click on the rotation keyframe here, maybe put in 360 degrees, and notice as soon as I hit enter, it turns back to 0, but it places a 1 in the first number. The first number is the amount of 360 degree rotations for the figure. So if I now come back to frame 0 and put 0 in that first one, you'll see that as it goes through, the angle goes up until it reaches 360 degrees, and then it resets back to 1. I could put in 2 here, and then you will see a double rotation going through to that 2 second mark. So it's important to note that each parameter that you animate in After Effects is unique to the property that you're animating at the time. Opacity is between 0 and 100%. Rotation is degrees of 360. Scale is an X and Y percentage of its original size. So if it started 100 by 100, then if I put 100% in both of these values, then it would be 100 by 100 in my viewport. But I can scale it well beyond 100% and well into the negative of 100%. It's important to note that if I go into the negative, it will flip both horizontally and vertically. Just undo that. Position is, the first number is X, which is left and right, and the second number is Y, which is up and down. And the anchor point is something that I'm going to cover in a moment. So it's important to understand that every parameter has its own specific way of treating the figures that you put in. The next thing I wanted to quickly cover was the different types of keyframes that we can get here. So what I'm going to do is just come to this point here and get rid of my opacity and my rotation. Now you'll notice that there is no longer any opacity animation and there's no rotation information. But if I just undo that for a second, if I was to be, say, here, and I take off the opacity and the rotation at that point in time, then that's pretty much what I'm stuck with. The scale still happens the way it should, but the rotation and opacity are specifically set to where I was in time when I switched the animation off. So be very careful about where you turn animation off. So I'm just going to switch them all off, and I'm going to set a keyframe. I'll move to the 1 second point. Actually, 2 seconds is fine. I'm going to set a keyframe for position, and then I'm going to move back to the 0 point in the timeline, and I'm going to slide this off screen. So it's a very simple animation. You can see it moving onto screen there. Now see the little dots along this line. They're indicating the frames in between these two keyframes. So the amount of dots, I can lessen the amount of dots by simply moving the keyframe closer to the initial keyframe, which means there's only 25 dots in between these two because I'm currently at 25 frames per second. If I go out to 2 seconds, then that's 50 dots or 50 frames between these two states. It's important to note that the computer is actually going to do all of the animation for me in between these two states. So as long as the computer gets to this point on the stage by this keyframe and it starts at this keyframe, then everything else is automated. But I can influence that by changing the types of keyframes that we have here. The first thing I wanted to show you is I can actually amend this animation in the viewport by pulling these handles and actually moving these keyframe points, which are indicated by the squares. Now, I'm not doing anything down on my timeline and I haven't changed or added a keyframe, but now I have a curved animation. And this is very unique for an animation system in a piece of computer software. Very rarely can I get a curved animation out of a 2-point line. Normally I would need a third point to get this curve. Now, what I can also do is pull this handle beyond. And this is something that I'm showing you this because eventually you'll run into some unwanted animation. Now, it's a little hard to see those keyframes in here. So what will happen is my logo will go beyond my keyframe and then it will pop back. So if you ever see that unwanted animation, be sure to check these handles and see if there's any issues there. Now, what I wanted to show you was a different type of keyframe. what I'm going to do is right click, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. And when I click on that, you notice it's no longer a little diamond shaped keyframe, but it's more like an hourglass. And if I play this or RAM preview it, you'll see that it will slowly start to settle. It won't be linear in nature. It's going to slow in to this keyframe here. And that can be illustrated if we just move this out of the road. Let's have a look at these little dots. Remember, these are frames. They're evenly distanced here, but then as they get closer to the actual final position, they get closer and closer together, which means there are more frames in this vicinity here than there are back here. So we can actually slow down the motion leading into and out of a keyframe. That gives the object weight. It makes it feel like there is some weight involved, and the human eye is always looking to understand the weight of an object when it's animated. So it's very important to adhere to these types of things when you're animating keyframes. Very rarely do we want to animate linear keyframes. In this instance, we want it moving at the start of the animation. So linear is fine for the very first position here. But let's say we were in here, and then we wanted it to slowly take off from this position and land slowly over here. We could select this keyframe, and we could Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease, or use F9 as the shortcut. And you'll see once again, there's lots of keyframes, or frames are quite close together here, and then up here they're quite a bit further apart. And if we play that back, we'll see that it slowly lifts off the ground, and then it slowly rests back down at the bottom. And that's exactly what we expect from these types of keyframes. So what we've actually affected there is the timing of how time is treated leading into and leading out of these keyframes for the position values. Okay, so let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. Well, what I'm going to do is put in a third position here. I'm just going to move this a little bit. So now I have this third position, and let's just give ourselves a little bit more of a curve here. So we haven't changed much else. We've just put a keyframe in the middle here, and it is set to Easy Ease, but let's go ahead and right click. In fact, I can hold down Control and click on that keyframe just to reset it back to a linear keyframe. And you'll see that the spaces in between the frames are exactly the same or identical, which is as they should be. Now I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to go into keyframe interpolation. It opens up this dialog box here, and you'll see that we have temporal interpolation and we have spatial interpolation. Now temporal is time, spatial is space. It's rotation, movement, scale, opacity, it's everything but time. So temporally it's set to linear, and it's indicated by a diamond on the timeline. But spatially it's set to continuous Bezier, which is indicated by the fact that it's curved. It's got a nice curve. Now, if I change the spatial interpolation to linear, watch what happens. It now turns into a sharp corner. And if we were to play that, you will see it take off, and then this sharp corner in the motion happens at the top. So what I can do is select that keyframe, go into keyframe interpolation, and I can change that to Bezier. And I'm going to change the temporal interpolation to continuous Bezier and go OK. So what I can actually do now is independently change these angles. So you can see that you can play with the types of interpolation for the keyframe to get some radically different animation. And I simply don't have a lot of time to go into much more detail than that. I just want you to experiment with this process until you become familiar with exactly how keyframe interpolation works in After Effects, and play with the stopwatches and create some animation just to really become comfortable with how it works. The next thing I wanted to show you was anchor points. Now these are crucial to understanding how things work in After Effects. Every layer has an anchor point. If I was to look at this first, the top soccer ball here, the anchor point is this little icon in the middle of the ball. And by default, an anchor point is usually located right in the middle of the layer dimensions. So whatever the dimensions of the layer are, the anchor point is right in the middle. But we can actually move it around, and sometimes it can find itself in the wrong place. We need to understand what effect that has on animation. So each one of these balls has a different anchor point. This one's right in the middle. This one is set to the top, and this one is set over here on the side. Watch what happens when I take all three of these, bring up my rotation. I can use the R shortcut key to bring up just my rotation values. I'm going to click on the stopwatch for all three, and then I'm going to move through to the 10-second mark, and I'm going to type in a 1 in that first value. And you'll see that it will animate over 10 seconds. It'll animate 360 degrees. Have a look at how very different the animation is for all three of those objects. We've got the first one is the only one that actually looks like it's animating correctly. The second one looks like it's oscillating around some other object. And the third one looks like it's sort of wobbling around an offset animation. So it's very, very important to understand what is going on with the anchor point. Now, the tool that can actually change the location of an anchor point is this one up here. It's called the pan behind tool, or the anchor point tool. Now, if I click on that, I can actually change the anchor point. Now I'm going to pull this anchor point right over here and have a look at the difference it makes to that animation. Quite a lot of difference. So it's very important to know what's going on with the anchor point. If I was to bring up position here, the position, the 162.5 and the 204.5 values, those specific values are all about the location of that anchor point. Now, so it's important to understand that this location is not over here on the ball or up here on the ball. It's always going to be where the anchor point is on the ball. So a good understanding of that is important to getting good animation. So what I've got here is a composition that I've specifically designed for you to practice some of the principles that I've spoken about. And what I can actually do is I can take this first soccer ball. I want you to really play with the animation here. I'm going to pull it up here, and we're going to try to create some animation over time. I'm going to come through to say about 10 frames, and then I'm going to pull it down onto the ground, and then I'm going to come through to about 20 frames, and I'm going to pull it back, but not quite as high as it started, and then go through about 10 frames again. Only this time not so much, not 10 frames. Just going to swap to my absolute time frames here. This time I'm going to go a little bit shorter. And then not quite as high. So what we're doing is we're diminishing in both time and in height. So a little bit shorter again. So this is not finished in any way, but I'm going to show you how this process works. So what I want to do now is grab all of the keyframes for now. This is one way of doing this. And I'm going to hit F9, or I can go Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. And if we have a look, you'll see that the ball feels like it's got a little bit more weight, but it's a little floaty at the bottom of the bounces. So now what I want to do is select just the keyframes where it's on the ground, not the ones where it's in the air. And I'm going to right click, go into keyframe interpolation. And I'm going to set the temporal value to linear and the spatial to linear and go OK. And if we play that back now, you'll see that we actually get something that feels like it has weight to it. It is dropping slowly from this point. It hits the ground. It's going as fast as it is throughout that bounce. And then as it goes back up, gravity slowly takes over, wins the battle, and brings it back to Earth. And then it hits the ground fast again. And if you look at that, you can see that there is weight to that ball. So be very, so definitely have a try to amend the keyframe types to try to bring a little bit of weight to this process. Now the last thing I wanted to show you in animation was a fantastic tool called the Puppet Pin tool. It's available in Photoshop, but it really comes into its own in After Effects. So So what I'm going to do is highlight the layer here, and I'm going to click on this icon up here called the Puppet Pin tool. When I click on it, I do get some extra choices here. We're going to ignore these for a moment and leave them at their default settings. I'm going to click on the head, and it creates a pin. You can notice down here in the timeline it says Mesh 1. And I'm also going to click where the neck meets the body. I'm going to click maybe every second one. And then finally one down here on the tail. And it doesn't look like we've actually done anything. And if I scrub on the timeline, nothing's really happened. But if I use the twirly arrow to bring out this Mesh 1, you'll see that if I keep going, there are 9 puppet pin objects that I've just created. Now, a really good way, or an easy way, to bring up exactly what's going on is to highlight the layer and hit U. What the Puppet Pin tool does is it automatically creates a keyframe at the point in time where my time slider was when I used the Puppet Pin tool, and it's created a keyframe for these puppet pin objects, and it's saved the animation for the X and Y value of those puppet pin points. So still nothing has actually happened, but I've got the starting point for an animation. So let me just highlight this deform and show you exactly what's going on here. If I go into my puppet pin and show you the mesh, this is the actual mesh. And the more dense this mesh, the more smooth this process goes. And I'll show you what that means shortly. What I'm going to do is change to my move tool or select tool. And I'm going to move my time slider. Let's go through to, say, frame 10. And I'm going to bring these two center pins here. Then I'm going to use my shift button to select multiples here, and I'm going to slide this up, probably about there. Let's straighten this one up a little bit, and probably pull this one forward a little bit. That looks pretty good. And what you'll see, here we go. And it's important that we get a keyframe for every pin object. So what you'll see is we get this happening. So if we just bring up a bit of real estate here, if we now go through to frame 20 and highlight all of the keyframes for this first position, go Control C to copy, Control V to paste, what we have is a cycle. So it will lift up, go back down, lift up, go back down. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste these out. I'm going to grab all of the keyframes, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Now, what that means is I've pasted this first row on top of this last row. I'm going to do the same again. Only this time I'll put my time indicator on the last row. Control C, which copies all of them, and Control V, which pastes them exactly on top. Do the same again. Make sure you're on the last row. Control C, Control V, and the last, we might as well Control C and then make sure we're sitting on the last row. Doesn't matter that we're going to have more keyframes go off the composition. Control V. So we're looking pretty good. We now have a animation, a cycling animation. I can now come up to my worm and just go into my transform perhaps and click on the position keyframe, move this guy over here, and then as he lifts up we hold the keyframe. So I'm just going to click on this little icon here which adds or removes a keyframe at the current time. Click on that, and then when we go through to 20, I'm just going to move him forward a little bit, and then we're going to hold on a keyframe again, and then when we go 10 frames further we're going to move forward a little bit, and then we're going to hold, and it's this series of holding and pausing, holding and moving, holding and moving. So we move forward again, and what we should be left with, if I just play this little section here, is some animation. So we've got this cycling animation using the puppet pin tool, and then we're using the position animation to propel this guy forward. And there's a whole lot we can bring to add believability. We can make these smooth keyframes, and we can offset the animation maybe on some of his antenna up here to really bring some added life. So as I think you'll agree, it's pretty simple to get this guy moving along like a caterpillar using that puppet pin methodology. So just in relation to animation, I thoroughly suggest that you try to explore as many of these keyframe processes as you possibly can. There is one thing I didn't cover today, which is the graph editor. I believe the graph editor is really not so much an entry-level aspect of After Effects, so that's why I've glanced over it. But the graph editor is a very powerful way to work with animation and to start amending the velocity of keyframes, start amending the curves, the temporal curves and things like that. But like I said, it's really a slightly more advanced way of playing with the animation parameters. So that's why I've overlooked it today. The information that if you are interested, definitely have a look in the online help system for the graph editor. Now the next thing I wanted to cover is pre-composing and nesting compositions as well. Now there are three main reasons why we pre-compose in After Effects. One is to stay organized and to keep things very tidy, which is very important when you're working on a large project or working collaboratively with other artists. The second reason is to allow for easy changes throughout the process. And the third reason is a little bit more technical in nature. Some effects, when applied to certain layers, don't recognize other changes that have already happened to that layer. And throughout the rest of the series, you will see from time to time that I will need to pre-compose a layer in order to effectively apply an effect to that layer while still maintaining the earlier changes I made to that layer. So basically, pre-composing is the process where I can select a layer or a series of layers and I can pre-compose them into a composition of their own, and back in the master composition where those layers started their life, all of those layers are then represented by one composition layer. A composition layer within another composition is simply a layer, and it's no different to an image, a piece of audio, a solid, etc. So let's put that into context and show you what that means. What I've got here is I've got a background image, which is literally just this gradient background, and then I've got this logo. Well, let's just say that that logo, I know I'm going to be needing it more than once. I know that I'm going to need it over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the layers that make up that logo, and if I use the eyeball here, I can see which ones they are. So with those selected, I can either come up to Layer, Pre-compose, or I can right-click and pre-compose, and it pops up this little dialog here. It allows me to name the composition. So I'm going to call this logo pre-comp. So if I click OK to this, it's going to automatically pop open that composition, and you'll see that in that composition the background is gone because the background is back here in the original composition. And now you'll see in my original composition all three of those layers have been replaced by this one layer, which is a pre-comp or a composition layer. You can tell by the icon that it is a composition layer, and you'll notice up in the project window here that I have a new item called logo pre-comp. Now this brings a lot of power, and what I can actually do is select that one layer. I can go into my scale, I can scale it down, I can take that layer and duplicate it. Control D is the shortcut to duplicate a layer. I'm going to duplicate it twice. I'm going to move one of those duplications over here, and I'm going to move the other one, say, over here. I'm going to scale that one down independently, and I might even scale this one up. Maybe pop it down at the bottom here. Something like that should be fine. So I'm able to duplicate that pre-comp as many times as I want, and I can do all sorts of things to it. I could grab, say, this one here. I can go up to my effects controls, and I could potentially just put a blur, fast blur, and just blur that one layer without affecting the other layers. I could also just undo that. I could double click on any one of these, will launch into the logo pre-comp, or I could just click on the logo pre-comp here, and I could maybe take this base color and let's put an effect, generate fill, and I'm going to change it to, let's change it to a green color. Now you'll see back in my original comp that they all have their own green color here. So as you can see, pre-comping is a very powerful way to allow you to edit, animate, change, apply effects to a group of layers that are designed to stay together for some reason. And pre-comping is very, very good for that type of work. And as you can see also, I'm staying much neater. If I was to have these same three icons without pre-comping, remember that the icon has 3 layers involved, which means there would be 9 layers in this composition as opposed to the 3 that we see here. And then if I needed another 4 or 5, it would exponentially blow out and I would have many, many layers just to represent something that could be represented just with 1 layer. Let's have a look at nesting, which is relative to pre-composing, but it's looking at it from a slightly different way of thinking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this text and I'm going to pre-compose, and let's call this base text and go OK. And you'll see that it now has its own, it's in its own composition. And back in the original comp, it's represented by a pre-comp, no different to the previous one that we did. Now what I'm going to do is just create a new solid, just layer, new solid, and I'm going to make this solid. Let's make it a red color. Just go OK. And I'm going to place it underneath the base text, and I'm going to scale it like so. And I might do another solid. Just go layer, new solid. We'll make this one black, and go OK. Place it under the red solid, and I'm going to scale that down just so that it feels like a bit of a frame, and that's not too bad. And then I'm going to take all 3 of those and pre-compose. I'm going to call this logo text and go OK. So in my original comp, I have one composition called logo text, and it's represented by this 1 layer. But in my logo text, I have the 2 solids plus my base text. And if I double click on that, there is my base text there. So what I can actually do is change, say, the text. Let's call this logo text. And then if we go back to our logo text, it's changed here, and then back in nesting, it's changed there. So I could duplicate this a couple of times, maybe move one copy down here, scale it down, similar to what we did in the pre-comping. And this one here, I'll move it up here and scale that down over here. And then I could jump into my base text and change this from logo text to just logo. And you'll see that it changes, pretty similar to the pre-comping we did before. But what happens if, say, we wanted the red to be 3 different colors? If we go into our logo text here, it's a red solid, and at the moment it can't be anything other than 1 color. If I was to change it, maybe go generate fill and change that to, say, a green, back in my original comp, all of them are changed to green. But what I can actually do is come up into my project, and this logo text, I can select it in my project window, Control D to duplicate, and you'll see it's called logo text 2. Enter to rename it. I'm going to call this logo text green, and then I'm going to duplicate that, Control D, enter to rename it, and this one's going to be logo text blue. And I might as well rename the top one logo text red. So now I have 3 different compositions. One is blue, green, and red. As it stands, they all are identical at the moment, but we can change these. What I'm going to do is double click on the green one, click on the red solid, and I'm going to change to a green. I'm going to double click in the project window on the blue text, click on the red solid and change that to a blue. And still back in nesting, nothing has changed. But what I can do, and this is a fantastic feature in After Effects, I can highlight a layer, and it's this logo layer down here. I can select the blue, hold down the Alt key and click and drag it on top. And what it's done is it's replaced that layer. I can do the same with the top one. Hold down the Alt key, click and drag the green one on top. So now I have a green, red and blue logo. And what's nested is the text. So I can now go into my base text and change logo to, let's call it 3 colors. Go back to my nesting and 3 colors, 3 colors, 3 colors, because every one of the logo text red, logo text green and logo text blue have a pre-comp in it, a nested composition for the base text. So I hope that's made sense. It is one of those things in After Effects where if you practice it, if you give it a try a couple of times, the penny will drop and you will always be able to rely on that knowledge. You'll always be able to use nesting and pre-composing to your advantage. But you've got to stick with it, because straight off the bat, it's going to be a little bit tricky to understand exactly what's going on there. But the important thing is to realize that we've got 3 pre-comps here. They're all unique, but each one of them has a common pre-comp inside them called base text. And that could have a common one inside it as well. And we could keep going. And this way, if the director turns around and says, I don't like the font, you could simply just go into here, double click on this and change the font to something different. And then back in here, the font changes uniquely. Now, this is just 3. Let's say you have 50 different layers all relying on the same text. I think you can see quite quickly that it really minimizes your workload and makes it very easy to change anything later on in the process. The ability to make changes throughout the process seamlessly and to allow for changes that say a director or a client asks for quickly without having to redo wholesale chunks of your work, that allows you to make more money and save time and effort in the process. So it's well worth understanding this process. Please try to practice it until the penny drops, and then you are comfortable with it and you know how it works. So we've had a brief look at animation, and we've also had a brief look at pre-composing and nesting. But I definitely think in order for you to understand these thoroughly, you should take the project files that are available with this episode and practice these principles so that you understand them, so that you can rely on them when you need them, and that you're comfortable when you need to implement them. So that's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.